Okay, so this, what we're talking about now is the price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand. This is when you're starting to make a lot of judgments in economic data, where you're now, your values, your pre-analytical visions are then determining what you're measuring and why. So you're measuring markets or firms to discover whether or not they have monopoly power or not. So the price elasticity of demand is, I'm sure everyone who's had micro and knows what that is. So that's a foundation of microeconomics. And it, again, it all depends on the pre-analytical vision of the analyst of what they're measuring and why, and usually with the end result in mind, right? So that you run a million regressions to get the results you want. But we're not using it, we're not attaching data to it. We're just looking at it as a learning heuristic. We'll critique the scientism of antitrust law later in the semester. But so OPEC, we're using the OPEC example. But first we'll start with the price elasticity of demand, which is equal to the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. So in the first example here, the firm raises their price by 100%, but their revenues only drop 50%. That means the firm has pricing power or market power under these assumptions. Any questions on that? Comments on that? So under these assumptions, the firm doubles its price, but only loses half of revenue. So therefore, then the firm has pricing or market power. It's monopolistic competition. It's not perfect competition, right? And so this is when the regulators get concerned. And so the regulators, politicians, politics is concerned with the short term, where the market and history is concerned about the long term. So the longer your frame of measurement, the more, and assuming free entry and exit, the more you have consumer sovereignty. And economists have not self-defined short and long term. There's no consensus on what's short term and long term in economics. If you're a Keynesian economist, an interventionalist, a regulatory economist, you're always in the short term. Because you need agitation to have intervention. So in this case, you double the price, revenues only go down by half. You have a price elasticity of less than 1, meaning the firm has pricing or market power. And is this in the long term or the short term? We'll explore that more. And then here in this case, the firm doubles its price, and revenues go down by twice as much for a price elasticity of demand greater than 1, meaning that the firm is a price taker and you have consumer sovereignty. Consumer sovereignty, price elasticity is greater than 1, the firm is a price taker. And so these are definitions under neoclassical economics, mainstream economics of monopolistic competition and perfect competition. And we'll find out from this OPEC example that in the long term, assuming free entry and exit, you have consumer sovereignty. So we'll look at that as an example. Okay, so the next thing in our study of price elasticity of demand in the OPEC example. Okay, so this comes from Gregory Mankiw, who's the chairman of the Harvard Economics Department. And he uses this as an example. He has a best-selling textbook. I think it costs $375. Okay, so we know what price elasticity is now. So when you have a demand curve that's 45 degrees like this, that illustrates the price elasticity of demand around 1, 45 degrees supply, price elasticity of around 1 for supply. And then when you have a demand curve that looks like this, you'll see that the price elasticity of demand is more flexible. It's greater than 1. Now, so this is going to illustrate the concept between long and short-term price elasticity using the overseas petroleum exporting countries. So I guess there's peace breaking out in the Middle East somewhat. I don't know. But there wasn't in the 70s. So you have this Arab-Israel war in the 70s. And so we're starting with perfect competition. Here's producer surplus, consumer surplus, as we discussed. Producer surplus and consumer surplus. Price elasticity of demand about 1, price elasticity of demand greater than 1, consumer sovereignty, perfect competition. So what happens is you have the Arab-Israel war. How many of them there have been, I don't know. But when I was at the State Department, what's his name? I think Gerald Ford negotiated peace between Israel and Egypt. And the guy behind me, when I was my first job in the U.S. government, was a accounts payable clerk. And then I wrote some policies to improve the process and then got promoted. But the guy behind me, on October 1, the beginning of the fiscal year, he would wire transfer $800 million to Egypt and 1.2 trillion. No, 800 million to Egypt and 1.2 billion to Israel on October 1 as part of the peace agreement. Camp David Accords, 1979. Look who that. That was Ford, right? So that's still going on today, of course. But so you have a Arab-Israel war in the early 70s. So the Arab countries get together and create these overseas petroleum exporting countries to penalize the West for their support of Israel. So what they did is created a cartel to try to monopoly power the oil prices, right? The West, everyone has a car. That's our individual symbol of freedom in the United States. Ford, 1967 Ford Mustang. So what the OPEC does is it shifts back supply to make gasoline more expensive for the West. So here they're shifting back supply. Making gasoline more expensive and less of it. So you'll see that this is called a Harbinger triangle, this lost consumer surplus. And then when you add the lost producer surplus, this is called the deadweight loss. of surplus. So this triangle is the deadweight loss, lost consumer and producer surplus. And you'll see that the consumer surplus is about equal to the lost producer surplus. So then, now gasoline is more expensive. So now you start to get the Japanese making more fuel efficient automobiles. So the Japanese are making more fuel efficient automobiles, supply and demand, entry and exit, competition. So they're making, yes. Deadweight loss. The lost consumer surplus and the lost producer surplus is known as the deadweight loss. And I should also note my own original contribution is that this is a reduction in absolute standards of living, reproduction. We talk about that. That's from classical economics. So you get a higher price, less quantity. The West is being penalized for supporting Israel. And the consumer surplus loss is about equal to the producer surplus loss. But now you're getting Japanese cars coming into the United States because gasoline is more expensive. So then there, believe it or not, there's another Arab-Israel war. So OPEC tries to do the same thing. But now, due to the passage of time, the demand for gasoline the consumer has more sovereignty because they're able to deviate, substitute out of more fuel efficient, out of gas guzzlers into more fuel efficient cars or other modes of transportation, including Japanese motorcycles. So now the consumer has more sovereignty with the passage of time. So if you're a regulatory economist, you would be here saying, oh, this is a problem. But if you're a free market or Hayekian economist, you say, with the passage of time allowing free entry and exit, the consumer has substitutes available, so therefore has more price elasticity. So now another Arab-Israel war. And so OPEC tries it again. Try to make this the same size. Yeah. And of course, the cartels don't work because there's always an incentive to cheat. But it's still a nice example. So now you get a little bit higher price, less quantity, but you'll see that the producer surplus loss is much greater than the consumer surplus loss. So the lost producer surplus is much greater than the lost consumer surplus. So given free entry and exit, monopoly is competed away. So if you're looking at a partial equilibrium model, just the gasoline market, you see monopoly behavior. But if you take a more general equilibrium model that covers the whole economy, then you don't measure and see regulatory behavior. I mean, monopolistic behavior that needs to be regulated. Does everyone see that? Due to the passage of time, free entry and exit, competition competes away monopoly power due to consumer sovereignty. So when you're measuring monopoly profits, you're measuring concentration in industries, you can do it in a partial equilibrium, which will capture partial equilibrium in the short term, which will give you monopoly behavior, or you can do it general equilibrium in the long term, which then there is no monopoly behavior because a competition allows them competing away any above normal monopoly profits. But cartels don't work in the first place because there's an incentive to cheat. So the next thing I wanted to add, so right about here, so American automobile manufacturers did not adjust their behavior. They didn't react to consumer demand, and they continued to make, big cars. And there was a person by the name of William Niskanen. And William Niskanen was the chief economist at Ford Motor Company. And during this period, and I don't know if one of the Ford family members or the board of directors or what, but they asked William Niskanen to write a memo describing how and why Ford should put trade barriers on Japanese cars. So Niskanen refused to do that because the deadweight loss that it causes. And so Niskanen refused to do that at Ford Motor Company as the chief economist to write a memo arguing for special treatment under the law. So they fired him. They fired Niskanen. So that completes our teaching module on price elasticity of demand and the OPEC example. What can be seen as monopoly behavior in the short term, as long as you have free entry and exit. In the long term, you get consumer sovereignty and above normal profits are competed away. Yes, sir. Oh, this just says, this means the loss of producer surplus is much greater than the loss of consumer surplus. So when you have competition, monopoly behavior, you lose.
So that Deadweight Loss in 1973.
Yeah.
That's the same as that. It's not the same, but that's the Deadweight Loss.
Yeah. Here's the deadweight loss in 1978. But you'll see that the producer surplus lost here is much greater, and the consumer surplus lost here is less, because they no longer have monopoly power because there's complements.
Was there always going to be a deadweight loss in this scenario? Did they avoid it?
Anytime, well, we'll explore that more in the semester. The most common example of deadweight loss is government intervention, but this would be the sales tax, and this would be the deadweight loss due to the sales tax. Yeah, so I'm going to stop recording now, or I should have said that already. Yeah, so what was your question again? Oh, okay, so you start out with perfect competition. Yeah, supply and demand. Then, in order to penalize this monopoly behavior, and we'll be looking at this when we look at the Marshallian cost curves, which is part of managerial economics, the production function. So here's the original supply, perfect competition. Then OPEC produces less in order to shift back supply, in order to make the price higher, in order for the West to have to pay more for gasoline. And the same thing here. You start out with perfect competition, then the cartel, the mainstream model of any type of monopoly power, you amazingly shift back supply to get above normal profits. Right? If you really have monopoly power, you produce as much as possible. But this is the mainstream model that regulatory economists use. So this is a critique of that model. And so here's supply shifts back. Here's the new price here, the new price here, meeting demand. Then the quantity shifts back. Right? So here's the new supply meeting demand with the new quantity and the new price. Does that work? All right.